Hello again. I have found when talking to people about the Middle East that there is widespread vagueness about the precise nature of the Gaza Strip. So I thought it might be worth giving a brief explanation of the status of this patch of land, which lies between Israel and Egypt. In 1948, the old Mandate territory of British occupied Palestine was supposed to be divided into two new countries, Israel and Palestine. Both would be autonomous nations. Almost as soon as Israel declared itself independent, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and other Arab countries invaded. They did this partly to destroy Israel, but also to see how much of Mandate Palestine they could steal and add to their own territory. Jordan seized a huge chunk of what was supposed to be the new Palestinian state and immediately annexed it. It became part of Jordan. This was Judea and Samaria, which is sometimes called the West Bank in Europe. The Egyptians managed to occupy Gaza, Rafah, and Khan Yunis, which was also supposed to be part of Palestine, together with the surrounding land. This is the territory which became known as the Gaza Strip. For the next 19 years, until the Six-Day War in 1967, Jordan and Egypt hung on to those territories illegally, making no attempt to allow the Palestinians to govern them. When Israel took over the Gaza Strip in 1967, they allowed the people living there to work in Israel and receive medical care there. They also began supplying the district with water and electricity for humanitarian reasons. There were political demands from some Palestinian organisations to be allowed to govern the Gaza Strip themselves and to set up their own nation there. This was the situation in 1978 when I moved there. I had already spent a year in Israel, living up in the north within earshot of the fighting on the Lebanese border. In the autumn of that year, I found myself in Damascus and Beirut during the Camp David peace talks between Sadat and Begin. Things were very rough in Lebanon at that time, so I found my way back to Israel via the Allenby crossing between Jordan and Israel, as it was known at that time. I then went to live in a settlement in the northern Sinai on the very edge of the Gaza Strip. There was a cluster of such places called Moshavim, and they centred around a newly built town called Yamit. These places, Sadot, Nativa Sarah and so on, no longer exist. After the peace treaty with Egypt, they were all demolished. The thumbnail to this video shows Talmei Yosef, which was the bleakest place on God's earth. I lived in the building on the left, and opposite was where the soldiers were stationed. One night, one of them went crazy and began firing at shadows, which was exciting when I was living just across the way from him. I used to go into Rafah and Khan Yunis and worked with people from Gaza. I think it's fair to say that there was discontent and a desire for self-government, but no overt hostility or hatred particularly. The standard of living in the Gaza Strip had shot up since Israel took over the place from Egypt. The Egyptians wouldn't let anybody leave the Gaza Strip. They wouldn't let them go to Egypt. They wouldn't let them do anything. They kept them in refugee camps. When Israel took over, they allowed the people from Gaza to work in Israel, and that was to their advantage. There was more or less full employment at that time in the late 1970s. There were occasional attacks, bombs and shootings, but these were carried out by Fatah, which was a political group headed by Yasser Arafat. I was in the area when the peace treaty was signed in May 1979, and there was a general feeling amongst many Israelis as well as Arabs that it would be right to grant Gaza autonomy. The idea was that if the people of Gaza would agree to a peace with Israel and let Israel live in peace and they would live in peace, that Gaza could become a small country, perhaps combined with Judea and Samaria, and that this would be the Palestinian state. But obviously, before such a thing could happen, there would have to be assurances that they wouldn't attack Israel and Israel wouldn't attack them. The problem was that when Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran about that time and turned it into a theocracy, the nature of the Palestinian resistance movement changed. Previously, it had been wholly nationalist. Now it was explicitly Islamic. In the end, Israel withdrew entirely from the Gaza Strip and let the people there rule themselves. There was immediately a civil war in 2006, 2007 between Fatah and Hamas won it. They took over. Far from wanting to live next door to Israel and coexist peacefully, Hamas began launching border raids, and although there had previously not been any barrier on the border, Israel built one to keep out the guerrillas. They continued, though, to supply electricity and water to the Gaza Strip. The idea of treating Gaza as just a neighbouring country was impossible because of the attacks. If it had not been for these, then the people of Gaza could have lived peacefully and carried on working in Israel as they had for over 30 years. There was even talk of an international airport being built and Gaza becoming a holiday destination for Europe, the way that Sharm el-Sheikh is in the Sinai. It's entirely possible that the Gaza Strip could have become a self-governing country, which was quite prosperous. It's certainly small, but there are brilliant beaches and Mediterranean coastline. There is huge potential there for tourism and all sorts of things. You might have heard today that Israel is no longer supplying the Gaza Strip with water and electricity. You see, for years the people of Gaza were clamouring for independence from Israel, and then after this was achieved, their leaders said they wanted nothing to do with the Israelis. Then, of course, the attacks were launched against Israel on Saturday. Perhaps we can best understand the situation if we think about Britain and Germany in 1940. Imagine if after the Blitz was launched against our cities in the autumn of 1940, we had been supplying electricity and water to Germany. Do you think it possible that we might have turned them off when the Germans started bombing us? I do. If those running the Gaza Strip wished for Israel to keep on giving them water and electricity, then they might have thought twice about starting a war. There is going to be a lot of suffering on both sides in the coming months. You don't need a crystal ball to see that. But that is in the nature of war. It may sound obvious, but people get killed in wars, and sometimes they go hungry and thirsty as well, and there are power cuts. Before launching wars, it is always a really good idea to think about stuff like that. The idea that Israel should keep supplying electricity and water to a country which hates it and has started a war against it is a strange one. Before starting a war, always stop and think what you are doing and what the consequences will be for your family and friends.